Please join me in welcoming to the Distinctive Voices podium, Dr. Brian Jacobson.
All right, hi everyone, and thank you, Jennifer, for the introduction, and I want to thank the National Academy for inviting me and hosting me here, and thank you all for coming. It's great to be here. I'm here to talk to you tonight about the media, okay? And when I say the media, I don't mean the news media, which is probably immediately where your mind goes, but rather I'm going to talk about media like movies and television and social media platforms. Now, when I think about these kinds of media, and I'm sure, and I'm sitting here with a lot of students, I'm sure when you think about these kinds of media, you're thinking immediately about entertainment, right? Maybe if it's the movies, you're thinking about going out for a night at the cinema, and maybe it's going to be date night or a bag of popcorn or something, or probably more often these days, you're thinking about kind of cozying up on the sofa on a Friday night with your phone and maybe a tablet or a computer and whatever your favorite streaming platform is, right? When we think about the media or the entertainment media, typically that's what we're thinking about. Ways to be entertained, ways to have fun, ways to be distracted, maybe ways to be informed if we think about the media in that way, but certainly some way to be entertained. That's not how we're going to think about the media tonight. Instead, I want us to think about two lesser-known aspects of our media, one of which has to do with all of the stuff that has to happen for us to be entertained. And not just the behind-the-scenes stuff that you might read about in, say, the Hollywood trade papers or by watching making-of documentaries. I'm talking about literal, physical stuff, material stuff, and the environmental consequences of getting and using all of that stuff. And then second, after we talk about some of that stuff and what goes into our media, I'm going to talk about the films that are made, not by Hollywood for entertainment, but rather by companies invested in getting and selling all the stuff that filmmakers need. Okay? Now, to get us in the mindset for this, let's start with a little, maybe like research experiment, okay? Although an admittedly really not scientific one for a Caltech professor or at the National Academy, but bear with me, okay? So I have a smartphone, right? You all have these, I imagine, yeah? Maybe you have two. Some of you probably have two, right, or something else. Don't get them out, right? They probably just told you to put them away, so I don't want to get any of us in trouble, right? But I have one of these, okay? Now, what's in these things, right? What are these things made of? Some of you might know, there's been some reporting about it in recent years, but for those of you who don't know, let's run through a rough list of things that are in our phones, okay? Here's a list that we can look at together. Aluminum, arsenic, calcium, chlorine, cobalt, chrome, copper, gold, iron, lead, lithium, magnesium, nickel, phosphorus, sulfur, silicon, tin, titanium, tungsten, and the list goes on, okay? Now, let's say that between those of us in this room and maybe the folks watching on the live stream, let's say we had 500 phones, okay? And that would mean that between us, we would probably have something like 10 grams of gold, 10 grams of tungsten, 250 grams of tin, 300 grams of lithium, 25,000 grams of cobalt, and 3,000 grams of copper, okay? It's hard to think about what those numbers really mean, and maybe it doesn't sound like very much. We're talking about grams after all. But think about it this way. To get that stuff and put it in our phones required mining something on the order of 20,000 kilograms of ore using 50,000 liters of water. And by the time a company like Apple mined, processed, and refined all those materials and then assembled, shipped, and sold our, let's say, 500 or so phones, it had generated more than 25,000 kilograms of carbon emissions. And again, it's hard to know exactly what a number like that means, hard even to visualize it, but we can try to imagine it, say, by filling 25 hot air balloons, okay? Or 15,000 fire extinguishers, right? You can just stack 15,000 fire extinguishers here on the stage. More importantly, we could try to get a sense of what these numbers mean by drawing a rough equivalence to other things we do and that we know. So say that 25,000 kilos of carbon emitted to make our phones is something like the annual electricity consumption of 15 households, or the amount we would emit if we drove a gas-powered car 125,000 miles, okay? Now, most of you, I have a feeling, don't think about your phone in this way very often, right, as a material object, except maybe when you drop it, right, and get that crack in the screen and then you realize it is a material thing. More often, you probably think about all the things your phone makes possible, right? Phone calls, text messages, photos, email, social media, scrolling, maybe doom scrolling more often these days. And maybe for some of you, you play games or you watch movies. That's what these technologies do at their best, right? They facilitate social and cultural activities and experiences, and that's great. And we're really only supposed to think about them as objects, as material things, when they break down, when they fail. At which point, we might get them fixed, but more than likely, we're just gonna throw them away and get a new one. Now, why? Why don't we think about them this way when they work? Well, as we've just observed, it's not the most appealing activity. After all, I just told you that we had to pump 25,000 kilos of CO2 into the atmosphere to get these phones, and I think we can agree that's not great. And it gets worse. All that stuff, the gold, the copper, the cobalt, it didn't spring up from the earth all by itself, right? It came from real places. China, India, Chile, Australia, Nevada, some of it from California, and it had to be dug up by real people, often in dangerous situations we'd maybe rather not think about. And if 25,000 kilos of CO2 weren't bad enough, we also have to consider the local environmental impacts of all of that mining, refining, and manufacturing, and the effects they have on real places and the people who live there. And all of that just behind, right, our few little phones, okay? Now try to imagine, with that in mind, a whole industry, a big entertainment industry, an industry like Hollywood with its thousands of phones and cameras and computers and the bright lights and the costumes and sets and the studio stages and the trips to beautiful locations. Much like our phones, we're not conditioned to think about movies and television in this way. Movies and TV are things we watch, things that entertain us, things that are often there to help us forget about the messy stuff of reality. But for a few minutes this evening, I want you to think about your entertainment media like this, as the products of an industry and a social and cultural world of technologies, raw materials, and energy-dependent industrial practices. And you don't have to take it just from me. So the Producers Guild of America also wants us to maybe think about the movies a little bit more like this. So in 2021, the PGA, reckoning with the environmental impacts of its members' businesses, looked at some raw data and found that the average Hollywood film generated from as little as 391 metric tons of CO2 for the smallest independent productions, up to as much as 3,370 metric tons for the big blockbusters, right? If we think back a little bit, say something like Oppenheimer or maybe Barbie, I don't know what movies you all like these days, but for the big budget films like that, right, the numbers are quite high. And in response, the PGA called for the motion picture industry to reduce its emissions by 50% by the year 2030. And again, we can pause on these numbers for a moment and try to have them mean something. So 3,370 metric tons, that's enough to power all of our homes, right? Everyone in this room and probably everyone watching online for up to 2 years, right? Just to make one movie, okay? Now, these kinds of facts and figures have slowly come to the forefront as Hollywood ponders its contributions to climate change, especially since the early 2000s, when a report commissioned by the state of California and produced by the UCLA Institute of the Environment found that the industry was producing, on average, 15 million metric tons of CO2 every year. In more recent years, the expansion of streaming services has added new concerns about the environmental effects associated with digital storage and streaming and playback. And analyses of these effects vary quite widely, but a commonly cited figure from the Carbon Trust think tank estimates that 1 hour of streaming emits 55 grams of CO2, and that would be something like microwaving 4 bags of popcorn, right? Which again doesn't sound like a lot, but if you think that's your 1 hour, right? And think of all the other people who are streaming at the same time. Now, most of that cost, probably up to 90%, and this is something companies like Netflix like to emphasize, comes not from the streaming of the content itself, but from running the devices to watch it. So it makes a big difference whether you're watching your movie on your phone or on a big screen TV, right? One takes a lot more power than the other. But nonetheless, streaming digital video probably accounts for 5 to 10% of global carbon emissions. And this on top, again, of the emissions required to make all that content in the first place. So put simply, what I want you to be thinking about here is how our entertainment comes at a great environmental cost. Many in the media industries and in the environmentalist movements are asking what can be done about it. And in the question period, I'm happy to talk about some solutions that are being tested currently, and maybe you can spend some of the time during the lecture thinking yourselves about what might be done. But rather than focusing on the future, I am a historian, and the bulk of my research, prompted by this reckoning in the present, looks backward, all the way back to the beginning of the movies and television to try to see, in part, how we got here, right? How our media became so dependent on raw materials and energy industries, right? Did media industries have to develop this way? What decisions, economic, technological, cultural, made modern media like this? And were there other possible paths? I'm also interested in how energy and manufacturing industries used new media technologies to promote their work and to teach us to embrace energy-dependent ways of living. And so tracing the entertainment industry's ties to energy industries has two stories. One is about how technology shaped the media that we have in a very literal, material way. And the other is about how new media, as tools industries needed to promote their work, shaped energy use and what we know about it. And I'm going to tell you a version of both of those stories right now. So part one is about the stuff of modern media. Now, it may be obvious enough to state that without technology, we wouldn't have any of our media, but what does that mean in practice? It's worth kind of stepping back for a moment and thinking about where media came from. So film and television were invented and developed in important centers of 19th century scientific and technological innovation. So in France, for example, we could think of someone like astronomer Pierre-Jules César Janssen, who on December 8, 1874, used the device you see here on the right to capture the passage of Venus across the face of the sun. And here's what that looked like. All right, 1874. Janssen's device was an early model of what later became the motion picture camera. And we can think about physiologist Étienne Jules Marey, whose interest in human and animal motion led him to further develop Janssen's tools at the Collège de France, where he developed a photographic gun that you see in the diagram here, and where his laboratory became a prototype for the first film studio buildings. There, he conducted experiments that depended on capturing images of birds in flight, people riding bicycles or unicycles, and his assistant playing the violin, right? And there are tons of examples of this, right? His efforts to try to understand the anatomy of various kinds of bodies and the physiology of motion by using early technologies to capture them in images. Now, if you don't know those French names, you're sure to know the name associated with film's origins. In this country, this is, anyone? Edison, right? This is Thomas Edison, okay? Film's invention in the United States took place directly alongside some of the key developments of late 19th century technology. So at the Edison Lab in West Orange, New Jersey, Edison and his team were working simultaneously on the movies alongside mining equipment, batteries, including batteries for electric cars, and of course, what else? What did Edison invent? electricity, right? He's working on electricity, right, and ultimately light bulbs, okay? So here at the laboratory, Edison built a film studio called the Black Maria, which is a strange building that we'll come back to shortly, right in the middle of the lab. And I actually didn't test before we started to see if I have a pointer. Let's see if I can figure out how this works. Yeah, here it is, right? This little building here is a film studio, right, located in the midst of these other buildings where they're doing what you would think of as more traditional scientific experiments. And this is the main lab building where they had a library. So this kind of strange building, which I'll talk about more in a moment, the Black Maria, is in the middle of this laboratory, but it too is a laboratory for experimenting with early moving image technologies. And you can see what these experiments looked like in fragments of early film tests like this one, which is almost so abstract that you can't really make out what it is, but it's a person, right, wearing a white shirt. Or this one from a little bit later that's much easier to comprehend. And it's a film of Edison's assistant, W.K.L. Dixon, arguably film's American inventor, even though we don't know his name these days. He was as important to the invention of film as Edison himself. And Dixon built the Edison Labs film studio, and you can imagine how his and these other men's thinking would have been shaped by their simultaneous work on other lab assignments in the milieu of innovation at the Edison campus. Now, when you think of Edison, you're very likely in this part of the world to think about maybe SoCal Edison, electricity, and we're going to come back to this a little bit later. But when I think of Edison, I think first and foremost about what he advertised as his greatest marvel, the movies. But the point here is that the two projects can't really be separated. As Edison rolled out his electrical system in New York, he was also rolling out a camera and film projection system. And as Edison electricity began to flow out across American cities, so too did the movies made by the Edison Manufacturing Company. Not surprisingly, for reasons I'll discuss in a moment, Edison films were often about Edison himself and his economic interests. Here, for example, is an image from an 1897 film of Edison pretending to do a chemistry experiment for the new movie camera. And the Edison film catalog is full of often beautiful images of early electrical illumination from American cities to places such as Coney Island. And this one that you're watching here is from the 1901 Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. Right? So Edison sent his camera people all around the world, or around, at least around the United States at first, to capture images of electricity, right? To promote the technologies he was creating. Now, from its early roots in these cradles of technological development, film then grew by the 1920s to become intensively energy and resource dependent. And much of that story in this country took place just north of us in Los Angeles, where film companies relocated around 1910. They came to California from New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia in search of longer days and brighter skies, especially in the winter when the kind of short days and cloudy days on the East Coast and in the Midwest made it impossible to make movies. And the reason was simple, right? They needed to expand shooting hours to meet a rapidly growing audience demand for movies in a time before film technologies allowed for filming in the absence of the sun. In the early days, as that strange first Edison studio illustrates, film's inventors found ways to harness the sun's power for what we might think of as a relatively sustainable solar-powered production practice. And we can see here what's great about this studio and so fascinating, and this is a diagram of it that Dixon drew, but it's mounted on a circular track so that the entire building can be rotated throughout the day to follow the path of the sun, and this retractable portion of the roof could be opened and the sun would shine down onto the stage, right? So that you can ensure the brightest light possible at any given moment for the best, the most legible recordings of the filmed image. Now, by the 1910s, even the early Los Angeles filmmakers, though, expected to rely more and more on artificial illumination. As studios and their backlots grew to encompass thousands and then tens of thousands of acres, Firms specializing in all sorts of film technologies, not least including lights, developed an industrial sector in Los Angeles built to service their more famous studio neighbors. And the rhetoric they used to market their movie technologies tells us something important about what film had become in these early years. Promising, for example, daylight at its best, or artificial sun, these technologies helped define film as a system not just of making entertainment, but also, and first, for simulating and controlling nature itself. And let me pause on this point and tell you why I think it's so important. And I'll say it again first so it doesn't pass too quickly. Okay? The movies were invented, okay, not just as a form of art or entertainment, they were also, before that, invented as a way to simulate the natural world by controlling it. And we live in the long wake, I think, of that ambition. We expect more and more that we can live in artificial worlds severed from the constraints of physical reality, whether that be online, on Zoom, or through virtual reality headsets. And there's so many great things about what that makes possible, of course, as those of you watching on the live stream right now are surely thinking yourselves, right? I didn't have to drive in today to go to the auditorium and watch this. The movies helped condition us to embrace this mode of artificial living long before computers and telecommunications made it possible. The movies helped us learn to understand that we could somehow be in the same virtual space as someone on a screen, and that we might want to be. But the more important point for tonight's purpose is that the movies also encouraged us to forget that all that simulation rested on an intense dependence on physical reality and the natural world. And indeed, as the movies became longer and longer, and their worlds became more and more immersive, right, more and more dependent on audiences momentarily severing themselves from everyday life, so too did the movie industry become more and more deeply entangled with the kinds of industries that people like Thomas Edison were helping to grow alongside it. And we could talk about ore drilling and the mining of the raw materials that went into film cameras and projectors before they ended up in our phones, but let's focus for a few minutes on two industries that filmmakers found waiting for them when they got to Los Angeles in the early 1900s, namely oil and electricity. And by the time the film industry got to California, the oil industry was already a big business here. Los Angeles was full of orange trees and lemon groves, but it was also dotted with oil derricks owned by names we know: Getty, Standard Oil, Pacific, Union, and so on. And here, for example, I realize you won't be able to see this even on the big screen, but we have here a great photo from the Huntington Library in which we can see some of these names from a little bit later in 1925 on land near Gardena. Now, because I'm from Caltech, I'll note especially one name and the derrick underneath the red arrow, and that is Joseph Dabney, an oil man whose fortune helped make him the namesake of One Dabney Hall, home of Caltech's Humanities Division, and my office, where I prepared this lecture. Now, these growing oil fields became sources of fuel for growing film studios, not least for their fleets of motor cars that helped them get around town and out to the distant corners of the backlots for location shoots. And they also became important parts of early films with dramatic and often humorous car chases, right? If you watch films shot in LA in the late teens and in the early 20s, usually comedies, you're gonna see a lot of car chases, right? Because they had these cars and they're like, what are we gonna do? And they would drive around and film stunts with them. More than just sources of fuel, the oil fields also became sources for images in film after film set in LA's oil industry, some starring the most important filmmakers of early Hollywood, including people like Mary Pickford and Lois Weber, who you see here in her 1915 film called Sunshine Molly, which is set in the oil fields of LA. And these fields became a source of wealth for Hollywood stars who reportedly went crazy for oil speculation in the early 1920s, with people like Buster Keaton buying up fields and reportedly even naming derricks after themselves to try to find an additional form of wealth along with what they were making in the movies. Now, by the 1950s, the two industries had even begun to merge under the broader purview of finance capital, with, for example, the Gulf and Western Company's 1966 acquisition of Paramount, once upon a time Hollywood's greatest film company, but now just one part of a conglomeration of firms manufacturing auto parts, mining for gold, drilling for oil, making fertilizer, and making and distributing films. Now, this merger made sense in a material way. As the film industry had grown during the first half of the 20th century, its dependence on oil grew with it, and so too did its need for all sorts of other resources. So Paramount, for example, bought whole forests of trees in Oregon to harvest timber to bring south for building its sets. Eastman Kodak, the maker of film stock in the days when movies were made of actual material film, pumped tens of thousands of gallons every day from Lake Ontario to its Rochester, New York factory, and it needed silver from mines in Canada, California, and especially Bolivia, and it needed fields of cotton to get cellulose and herds of cattle for gelatin, and again, trees and their pulp to extract a variety of chemicals, and eventually when film was made of polyester, and when we get to video with its magnetic tape, Kodak needed petroleum, and we could again name all those metals that have become the stuff of modern media today. Now, among the things that oil could also be used to power were steam plants for electricity. And now we come back to SoCal Edison. And we tend to think filmmakers came to California for its plentiful sunlight, and they partly did, but they also needed electricity to power all their machines and the electric lights they were increasingly using instead of or in addition to the sunlight that supposedly brought them to California in the first place. Los Angeles was ready for them, having begun in the 1880s to develop a significant electrical grid powered initially by coal and then fuel oil, much of it pumped in the significant oil fields in places like Ventura and at other sites such as Signal Hill and Santa Fe Springs that you might know depending on where you're from around here. Now, by the time filmmakers arrived, investors, including Henry Huntington, whose Pacific Electric red car system of streetcars needed substantial sources of power, had built oil-powered generators such as this one at Redondo Beach, but they had also set their sights on the potential for hydroelectric power in the falling water of the High Sierras. Indeed, by the 1920s, much of Hollywood's power was coming from places such as Big Creek, where reservoirs had been created and tunnels blasted through mountains to divert the mighty San Joaquin River, creating channels of powerful current to turn generators. And just to give you a sense of what you're looking at here, this is a SoCal Edison map from 1929, and right down here is LA, right here's Hollywood, which they indicate with a man with a film camera, and up here we're in the High Sierras. This is a place called Big Creek, where they're building generators like this to capture all this falling water and then sending it down to Los Angeles, right, over the San Gabriels, right, and down through these lines, right, to service LA. And they're also still using fuel oil sent by pipeline, right, from places up here, from Ventura, down to Long Beach for large, again, still fuel oil-fired plants. So it's a diversified, electrical grid, but a lot of the power is coming from way up here and getting sent 1,000 miles down to LA. Now, by the 1930s, this more sustainable source of power was generating, in fact, so much electricity that companies such as SoCal Edison couldn't always sell all of it. And government reports from the late 1920s even predicted that hydroelectric power could soon replace oil altogether, at least for domestic power and even in some industries. Now, that did not, of course, end up happening, in part for reasons I'll talk about in the next section. But first, let me step back from all these details just for a moment. And we can come back to the beginning for a second. What I've been trying to describe for you here is the long arc that takes us from film's origins in the 19th century as a solar-powered technology with early ties to electricity and ore mining, to a 20th century business firmly entrenched in raw material and energy-dependent practices, and then finally to the 21st century industry that pumps out CO2 by the millions of tons per year. And one important lesson of this story, I believe, is that film and television are industries that have no need to depend on any particular energy source. They need not depend on any specific set of materials to achieve their ambitions. Film, as the first filmmakers demonstrated, could be made by cranking a camera with a spring or with your hand, and it could and still can be lit entirely by the sun. Even during the 1920s, when they had embraced electric light and industrial scale, they could still work in Los Angeles largely using hydroelectric power, not fossil fuels. Then as now, film and TV companies found upside where they could get it. If you can provide a reliable energy source that is cost-effective or sustainable materials that work, they will take it. And so it really is possible to imagine a more sustainable future, even for a giant industry like Hollywood. The challenge is that we have to be able to imagine a world, a culture, and a politics invested in fostering that future. And the role movies have played in shaping that world and that culture and that politics is the next part of the story. So that can take us to part 2, the movies about the stuff. So no sooner had people like Thomas Edison and companies like the Edison Manufacturing Company developed the movies than they realized how important the movies might be, not simply as a new form of entertainment, but also as a tool for promotion and persuasion. Edison was an inveterate self-promoter, and we already saw him playing chemist for the camera and proudly displaying the glories of electric light. Edison also partnered with America's powerful railroad interests, promoting their lines and machines in short films that mesmerized viewers and for which they received in return free passage for film crews and equipment. Edison was by no means alone. During film's early years, one of his chief rivals, George Westinghouse, with whom Edison famously dueled in the so-called Battle of the Currents between AC and DC, similarly recognized film's power, and indeed Westinghouse invested in one of Edison's main movie business rivals, a company called American Mutoscope and Biograph. Westinghouse helped that company outfit a film studio in Manhattan with electric lights, making it the first American film studio lit entirely by artificial illumination. And in turn, Biograph made a series of important movies about Westinghouse in 1904 for the St. Louis World's Fair. And you can see here, right, these two technology titans fighting it out, not just in their labs, but also in the realm of culture. Now, it may come as little surprise to you that films were immediately seen as tools for promotion and persuasion. After all, as I always remind my students, it's hard to get through the day without encountering images that seek to move us and to try to shape our actions. Corporations like Edison and Westinghouse and the railroad companies recognized film's potential power. And I want to stress that they understood this power not simply in terms of its use for promotion or sales or even persuasion, but more so for the power it gave them to define the world in their image and to project visions of what a world could and should look like if made in their corporate imagination. The Ford Motor Company, namesake of Edison's close friend Henry Ford, was one of the really most important early innovators in using film as this kind of tool. Ford established an in-house filmmaking unit in 1915, and from there it churned out films that it freely circulated to schools and churches and community groups and other businesses. Importantly, the films often were not about promoting Ford automobiles. In fact, most of the films had nothing to do, or at least seemingly nothing to do, with Ford or its products. Instead, they were about American culture, and they projected in short 15 to 20-minute films a vision of America as Ford saw it. And we can look at one example together. This is a 1922 film titled Democracy in Education. And let's watch a few minutes just to give you a sense of what this sometimes looked like. And one thing I want you to notice, the film is silent, so we can just kind of read along. But one of the things I want you to notice is that after the opening slide, the name Ford still appears at the bottom, right? This is from the Ford Educational Library, but this isn't a film about Ford at all, right? In its place, we get history and civics lessons. Oh, sorry. And the film goes on from here to tell us what some of those things are, right? What some of those values should be. And no doubt the vision Ford Films delivered was consistent with an America that would support Ford and its cars. But on the surface, the film seemingly had nothing to do with promotion or persuasion. They worked what I see as a more subtle and effective form of world-making magic by attempting to create the social, cultural, and political conditions for corporate success. And we might ask ourselves, was the owner of a car company really the right person to be teaching American children about government, democracy, and civic life, as Ford was trying to do? Now, closer to home, Southern California Edison's bounty of hydroelectric power increased during the 1920s and into the 30s, so much so that those late 20s reports could predict that hydropower would make fossil fuels unnecessary for most domestic needs. And the company responded not by congratulating itself on a job well done, but by making a push to increase electricity use in California homes to meet its supply. So in 1934, SoCal Edison partnered with Hollywood independent producer Rodney Gilliam on a film called Mrs. Mortimer Jones Prepares Dinner for Eight, a 10-minute Technicolor celebration of all things electric in the kitchen. Now, the film was notably just the second experimental Technicolor short, right? So it's almost one of the first, let's say, industrially produced color films made in the US. And what we have here is advanced film technology and its power of spectacle being put in the service of a drive for expanding electricity consumption. And I want to just show you the beginning of this film, because we have it. One thing to note here is the candle burning on the right, which is going to seem rather quaint in just a moment. The idea that you need a candle would be ridiculous after the beginning of the film.
I wonder what Grandma would think of a really modern electrical kitchen like this, and of a housewife like Mrs. Mortimer Jones, who has just had a few of the girls in for lunch and is now facing the problem of finishing her housework in time to attend the theater this afternoon. Washing dishes doesn't seem to be any more of a problem for Mrs. Jones than shuffling the deck for another hand of bridge. And speaking of hands, she needn't worry about red, roughened hands and ruined manicures, as long as she can do her dishwashing by the turn of a switch. And wouldn't Grandma be amazed to see the dishes wash themselves in boiling hot suds? Meanwhile, Mrs. Jones has been setting out the ingredients to make a cake. Yes, sir, that's tomato soup. Are you surprised? Well, you just watch this and you'll learn how she uses it in the recipe for her famous mystery cake. 4 tablespoons of shortening, 1 cup of sugar, and 2 eggs. That's all for now. The tomato soup will come later. And here's where her electric mixer will come in handy. The ingredients are now creamed together until they are light and fluffy. In the meantime, she has sifted together 2 cups of flour, 1 teaspoon of soda, 1 of cinnamon, 1 of allspice, and 2 of baking powder, which she is now adding with the tomato soup. The most common reason for poor cakes is that the ingredients are not well mixed together. Proper mixing used to require an iron spoon, an iron arm, and an iron woman. But now, while Mr. Edison does the mixing, Mrs. Jones starts her electric oven on high to preheat for the baking of her cake, and then adds 1 cup of raisins and 1 cup of nut meat, while the mixer keeps on mixing and mixing until the cake is as uniform as the flour it was made from.
Okay, right, so Mr. Edison is going to do the work in the kitchen, and the film goes on and talks about her electric refrigerator and how she's going to be able to have food set aside, and then Mr. Jones calls and says, uh-oh, I'm bringing 6 colleagues home for dinner tonight, so you got to make us dinner, and fortunately she has a lot of extra food stored in the refrigerator because electricity again, right, and you can see how this goes on for 10 minutes. Now, The goal here, of course, was to boost SoCal Edison profits, but also, and more significantly, SoCal Edison was using these kinds of films and other promotional materials, especially photographs, to help encourage more energy-dependent ways of living that would ensure not simply profits for hydroelectric power, but ultimately that hydroelectric power would no longer even be sufficient to accommodate the expectations of modern domestic life suddenly lived in overwhelming brightness. Now, by the middle part of the 20th century, few major businesses or industries were not engaged in this kind of filmmaking practice. Some, like Ford, had their own filmmakers in-house, but many others turned to an entire kind of parallel film industry running alongside Hollywood's entertainment business, made up of companies specialized in making short films about business and industry. Some of these firms glamorized industries with spectacular displays of all the industrial things. So you have films about oil derricks and refineries and ships and ports and assembly lines and trains, planes, and automobiles. But many followed Ford's lead in spreading softer forms of propaganda through cultural documentaries sponsored by industry and infused with its vision of an America with the social and cultural values these industries believed they needed to succeed as much as they needed people to want to buy their products. Now, during the 1950s and 60s, American companies made thousands of films like this to tell stories about their products, and that's not even to mention the advertisements, product placements, and other cultural forms through which new technologies and resources such as oil and gas were made to seem like normal, inevitable, irreplaceable aspects of the good American life. Now, I want to end by focusing or talking a little bit more for a moment about how oil and gas companies in particular marshaled film's power to help steer the world in their favor. And this is something that I've been writing about recently in a project asking what kind of visual world the development of oil and gas industries created in the 20th century, or how, in other words, the choice to power our world on oil and gas changed what the world looked like. Oil and gas companies took the lead in adopting culture for the purposes of world building and agenda setting, all designed to convince everyday people that their world could only be powered by petroleum and nothing else. And they did this, it is important to remember, even as oil companies themselves came to recognize, thanks to their own scientists, that their products had detrimental, potentially even catastrophic consequences. During the rise of the environmentalist movement in the 1970s, movies became a way for these companies to control environmental narratives, whether by sowing doubt about global warming and then climate change, or by claiming the authority to know what to do about it. So the images you see here, they look like they could be from any environmental documentary, but in fact, they are from a 1970 British Petroleum-sponsored film called The Shadow of Progress, that told viewers that whatever environmental problems they faced at the end of the 1960s weren't anyone's fault, and certainly not BP's fault. And in fact, if anyone was equipped to fix whatever those problems were, it could only be British Petroleum, right? And they made lots of films like this. Oil companies pioneered these techniques in the 50s and 60s, and they remain part of the industry playbook, although it tends to play out more these days, say on YouTube or on social media, where you could go and watch the videos on Shell's YouTube channel for a sampling of what this looks like. To conceal the much less favorable story of their products' effects on the environment and human health, and to continue to promote unsustainable energy economies and ways of being, these companies continue to use film culture today. And what they had learned by the 1950s is that cultural power is one means to attain political and economic power. They learned how to acquire this power from artists and filmmakers by enlisting their creativity in a meaning-making process that every business uses and in many ways requires. At the same time, though, those invested in alternative energy sources and more sustainable futures can learn and are learning some of these lessons too. And I'll just give you one example to end on a different, maybe perhaps more positive note. So in 2014, Greenpeace had been fighting for some time to convince the Lego company to stop making Legos out of plastic and to end its sponsorship with Shell. And they did not, or have not yet succeeded on the plastic front, but they did finally succeed in the latter thanks to this short film that I'll play for you now.
awesome when you're living on a dream.
Okay. So the video was produced by a British advertising agency called Don't Panic and released on YouTube on July 8th, 2014. And it received more than 4.5 million views in its first week and eventually helped indeed push the Lego company to end its half-century partnership with Shell. And what Greenpeace did here was to flip what I see as an old script, turning an oil company's control over culture back against them to tell a different story. In short, Greenpeace succeeded by beating Shell at its own game. And people often ask me when I talk about this stuff, can culture really do anything to help enact tangible change? And I think simple stories like this Lego film tell us that the answer is, well, maybe sometimes yes. But the larger point I hope you will leave with tonight is that culture and entertainment always depend on material realities that we'd probably rather forget, but we should keep in view. And not because we should stop making movies or having phones or having culture because it's too wasteful or too detrimental to the environment. It doesn't have to be, and we should have culture. But rather because we can make so many of these things in more sustainable ways if we try. And because a world in which we recognize and take responsibility for the material costs and consequences of our actions, and in which we make sure that the most innovative and profitable companies, be they technology companies or culture companies, also take responsibility for their actions, will be a better world. Thank you.